All right, if we're lucky, you're seeing what I'm seeing. So, first of all, thank you, JB, for inviting me, and thank all the rest of you for coming and joining us today. I was going to say this morning for you guys, but it's this evening for me. It's almost 6 o'clock here in California. I have a uh, set of slides up on this link here. I will try to remember to, let me see if I can get up here to get into the chat. And well, it said chat, but it didn't get me there. I will eventually go into the chat and put that link into the chat. In the meantime, let's go ahead and get started. So, my talk is about helping language learners learn on their own. This is something I've been interested in for many, many years. I even taught a seminar for about 7 years called Learning English on Your Own. And I'm particularly interested in this in the area of listening. What you're going to see to a large extent came out of an experience I had. I was asked to write a chapter for a book on informal language learning and what teachers could do to support it. And so that's where some of the organization of this particular talk comes from. Although that paper was a lot more academic and less fun than I hope this will be. I'll begin with a bit of background and then talk about three areas related to this. How do you get students able to select appropriate digital resources to do their independent learning? How do you help them identify and control the technologies and tools to make listening more effective, practice more effective for them? And what sort of techniques or strategies and procedures can they use to support learning? There's at the end of the slides, there is a reference list, and that has the information about the paper that I had referred to that this builds from. So I'm going to talk about informal learning a little bit first, and then why listening within all the areas you could be doing informal learning in. And then for those of you who know some of my work over the last almost 20 years now, I will be once again flogging the dead horse, hopefully not quite dead, of learner training. So self-directed informal learning, it's learning outside the classroom. So the first thing I want to do is give you my take on the distinction between informal versus formal learning. This is something I ended up having to read a lot about in order to write that chapter. And like most other things, experts don't seem to agree on a definition. But at a rough level, formal learning is what takes place in the classroom or maybe outside of the classroom in a very structured way. So if you give a homework assignment and everybody's doing the same thing, that's still more formal learning because of the structure involved. Informal can in fact take place inside a classroom as well. So it's not just the location, but generally informal learning is more likely to be outside the classroom, whether the classroom is a physical one or an online one. This overlaps with, but is not the same as intentional versus incidental learning. Some people seem to take the position that informal learning is by nature incidental, and I don't think that gives language learners, enough credit for why they're engaging in what they're doing. So incidental learning means you just are involved in using the language and you pick the language up through that. Intentional learning can start with incidental learning, but it also means you may be paying attention to certain things, and you may even in fact have set things up so that you take notes, reflect, and so on. This is what we've known since the late 1970s are strategies that good language learners use, whether they're learning it in a classroom or just out there in the real world. In a recent Language Learning and Technology Journal special issue, there was the theme of Call in the Digital Wilds. And if you're not familiar with that and you're interested, this is a good place to start because, like everything else in LLT, it's open access. A key concept of this is pleasure, and this is something that goes all the way back to Curation in the 90s, but then has been resurrected a number of times in between now and then, notably by Toffoli and Socket. So you're not going to engage in stuff usually unless you're enjoying it. A lot of the work that I did in my advanced listening class, which I taught for almost 20 years, was focused on preparing the students not only to do work on their own outside of the class time, material that they themselves chose and paths through that material that they chose, but also to prepare them for what happens after the 10 weeks we have together are over. The goal is to give them the experiences and the tools to move ahead on their own. Okay, so what about teacher support for this? If you're a teacher and you're thinking of spending some time, and it does take time, as well as some energy on your own part, getting the necessary background knowledge and reconceptualizing it for your teaching context, what are the short-term gains? Well, students get some control. Ideally, I note the word possible there. I want to hedge here because it's not automatically the case that just because you set everything up appropriately, the students will bite into it and get out of it what you expect them to. So these are possible and hopeful things. I did research on my listening class over a period of about 2.5 years back in the 2007 to 2010 range. And during that time, because I was looking at a lot of individuals, I could see the differences. There was quite a bit of diversity in terms of how they engaged in this ability to be independent and what sort of extra prodding or coaching they might need versus the importance of maybe giving them as much free rein as possible, because some of them went with this idea and really knew what they were doing. The goal ultimately, whether you're scaffolding them along the way a lot or a little, is for them to build confidence, know that they can do this without a teacher there either to report to or direct. And an important part of this is that students, if you give them the time to discuss when they get together in groups, they can share what the challenges and successes were in doing this. Long-term gains, I'm not going to go over that in too much detail, but this is the idea that they're more likely to continue working on their own. We know there's going to be more and more out there for them to do on their own. And Chun, Kern, and Smith claim that this is likely to help them develop new digital literacies, much more so than just in a rigid classroom setting. Okay, the last or next to last part of background here. Why listening? So we've thought for years that listening is the input that you get that helps drive language. Whether you get it through interaction or through listening more one way, the material is still coming in. And that comprehension that you do as a language learner does support language acquisition. Some would say that's all you need. For some students that may be true, for others clearly not. There's been this huge expansion of free online resources. I can remember having to tape television programs on a VHS player so that I would have things to hand out to students to work on outside of class. That is long since past. We have not just the static computer lab or individual computers, desktops, laptops, but also smartphones. So the mobility has greatly increased access. And then we have all these comprehension supports, and more these are showing up on major websites like YouTube. I'll talk about that in a bit. So some key assumptions underlying the work I'm doing. I am focusing on one-way listening. Interactive listening is really important, but one-way listening where students are listening to a video or even an audio text, it's something they can do on their own. In my experience, and especially talking to others I've passed this idea on to, it seems to work best with intermediate and beyond. If you start this too early, then you can still do it, but you do need to have a much more limited choices available for a lot of students, or they're likely to get in over their head, especially if they're trying to listen to authentic material. Finally, the teacher needs to be really reflective about this, and these are a couple of links, one to a book and one to a chapter in the book that Sophie Anu, Georgiou, and I did back in 2017 on teaching English reflectively with technology. And it has a lot of good case studies of teachers doing this and justifying what they were doing, why they were doing it, and what lessons they learned from it. And this brings us to learner training. So, I've been spending the last 2.5 years trying to learn bass. And luckily, I've had a couple of really good teachers helping me along. I never quite got to this stage, but this is what can happen. This is obviously a bit of an exaggeration, but this is what can happen when people just take something and go with it without really having guidance in thinking it through. So back in 2004, I wrote a paper in which I offered 5 principles for learner training. In 2013, I followed that up with a case for learner training, and these are the reasons why I think learner training is something you should be spending some of your class time on if you're using technology and expecting students to use it outside of your supervision. In particular, with that examples of success, Glenn Stockwell and I did a study over a few years, even in the early part of that study, and this is as good a time as any to see if I can get a continued shared screen here. Nope, that's not it. Oh yeah, that's it. All right. So this is the talk we gave, I believe, at APACALL. And if those of you who know Glenn know that he's been working in mobile learning for a number of years. He developed a very sophisticated app in terms of its ability to track what students were doing. And so partly from working with me on a joint paper on mobile learning that we wrote in 2012, I think came out in 2013, he became interested in learner training for his own class, a class he'd been teaching for a number of years. We set up a pseudo-controlled study here using the 2013 data as the control group, and then in 2014 doing more learner training. And again, this is a situation where he had done the same thing for a number of years. And initially he was only giving the students a little bit of technical training. He was using a model of mine that involved also strategic and pedagogical training. So he'd spend, maybe 10 minutes in a class explaining things to students, and importantly, letting them get into groups and talk to each other about how they were using the app outside. I don't have time to really go over the app, but it was basically a listening and vocabulary development app that was designed to support the regular work they were doing in class and was completely optional. So if the students used the app, they were more likely to do a lot better on the quiz they got the following week. So this is some of the work he did. Uh, this was really interesting because this was optional, and his two groups were essentially the same in terms of levels. Their first year law students at Waseda University, 2 classes. And again, this is optional. The group that was getting the training ended up voluntarily spending quite a bit more time. And this is likely why they did better. We don't have a way to tease that out. But this is what really interested me and him. I can get to it here. The quizzes that he gave, and these were equivalent from year to year. In the first quiz, before they had any training, the 2014 class actually did significantly worse than the 2013 class. And you can see them building up, and because they're, I think, 30-something students in each class, I forget what the exact number is, but anyway, by the time there was a 3 to 4% gain, it was already hitting statistical significance. And later on, much, much more. So I won't go through that in any more detail, but it's just an example of how when you institute learner training, you get some gain back. The students feel like they're getting more control. They're being shown how to get more control. Okay, so now for the first of the 3 big areas, selecting resources. So you want, when students are doing things on their own, they usually stop at that first bullet point. And that is important. Remember this idea of pleasure being there. So you want to make sure that they know how to find interesting material. Knowing what we do about language learning, if the goal is not just to have them pick up content out there, but actually to improve their listening skills, build their vocabulary, and in general, maybe raise their overall language proficiency, working with material that's somewhat familiar instead of completely new, where the content is something that they have knowledge schemas for, that's going to make better material. So sometimes they think the most interesting thing is something they know nothing about, but that puts a pretty heavy burden on them. And I actually talked to them about the idea of limited cognitive resources for doing things. And if you've got familiar material, not think something you know everything about, it should still be a new video clip, for example, but something that you have some background in, you're going to do better with it, and it's going to be easier to use that than it would be otherwise. And a lot of times people are familiar with things they're interested in. I had one student who just did a independent project listening to NBA games and developed a very good vocabulary base for understanding that. I also think it's critical for vocabulary development to make sure the material has text support and either the captions or subtitles or ideally transcripts as well, and then correctly leveled material. This is the hardest part, both for teachers and for students, is to find something that's enough of a challenge to make it good and useful, but not so much of a challenge that it's frustrating. And this LexTutor site has a very nice vocabulary profiler on it here, where you can put the transcript of something in and find out what the levels in 1,000-word bands are of the vocabulary being used. It's not great. In some ways, it doesn't do anything with idiomatic phrases and so on, but it's a lot better than just using intuition. And it is something students can learn how to use, and some of them find it really helpful. Okay, some examples. These are just ones that my students particularly have enjoyed. Dedicated materials, authentic materials, both. Increasingly, they want the authentic materials. And then the last point in this section is about curation. So one of the things we can do as teachers is help collect possible material for students that they can still have a choice within. There was a time when language teachers might have, classroom libraries of readings for students to take home with them. In this case, it's digital. So what you're going to do as a curator is add stuff. You're going to find material, not just that's interesting, but you're going to do this with it. You're going to collect it, organize it, sequence it, if it seems to be in some sort of sequence from slightly easier to slightly more difficult, or if the content builds up that way. Provide some language level information to the degree that you can, and then add pedagogical support. Just like when you go into a curated exhibit in a museum and there's a little plaque or a card there that tells you something about what's going on. The qualities you're looking for in the content are these. In particular, you want it to be stable. All these other ones are really important, but you don't want something that's going to disappear if you're going to put some time into getting these curated sets together. So I'm not going to go out to it here, but again, the link will be available after the talk. This is a set of TED Talks that I curated into 4 groups of 4 to 5 talks each, so that students pick a theme like being green or humor, and then find talks within that. Lingo Rank is a more commercial site that also uses TED Talks and have indexed them according to the Common European Framework references. And then Khalil Store is a project from the European Union that has all kinds of languages in it, material that's from the A1 to the C2 level, and has bilingual, multilingual dictionaries hyperlinked to the text within the transcripts or the captions. Okay, the second of the 3 areas is online tools and resources. For those of you who work in listening, whether it's part of an integrated class or something that you've isolated, there's obviously a lot of types of text support, transcripts. The TED Talks have interactive ones where if you look at the transcript, you can go to a place in it and click on that sentence and it will jump to that part of the video. That can be really good for instruction, but once students understand how to use this, it can also be very good for them to go back and find a word that was new to them and listen to it again in context. Captions or subtitles, both first language and second language, and of course the automatic captioning that Google does in YouTube. Various kinds of online glossing and dictionaries. If it's dedicated material, it's likely to have something that's been created by the developer, and the definitions there are going to be more like a gloss. And then, of course, just links to online dictionaries. Media players. This is a very important tool for listening. I have my students at least experiment with the VLC player, but there are lots of other ones. They have all these controls. Students may or may not know of all these controls, in particular something like the jump control, where by hitting shift back arrow, you can go back 3 seconds. Really important, getting that repetitive loop if there's something you're trying to hear and you want to hear it again. Much less frustrating than using the slider. Adjusting the play speed, especially slowing it down, and then graphic equalizers, which most people don't seem to either know exist or want to play with unless they're having fun with particular types of music. But they're good for human speech too. This is an example of the VLC player, and I've circled there where the speed control is, and then the jumping back or forward using the shift arrow keys. And then this is the graphic equalizer where you can bump the mid-ranges, the frequencies in the mid-range up, and that makes human speech a little bit easier to hear. Generally, media players are optimized for music rather than speech. Okay, I'm going to skip over the research findings because I can see we have time issues, as I often do here. But all of these are in the references. The main thing is there is some research to support using these, especially the speech rate material. Some very interesting early results from Yong Zhao, and then only a little bit after that, Karen McBride did work on her dissertation with speech rate. But all of this was done before we could students could automatically control the rate themselves. This was back when you had to have somebody code for you the change in the speed, or simply record it speaking more slowly. So there's room for a lot of work here. Okay, in terms of strategies, one of the things that we got out of the research we did over those 2.5 years is that students start with this idea that once they comprehend something, they're done. And that's what they want to do, for the lectures in their content classes. But there's a lot more you can do with that material, without making it boring. Rost and Wilson offer a lot of examples of that. So again, coming up, I think, on my final 2 minutes here, some objectives for practice sessions. So even though I want students doing this for pleasure, ultimately, within the framework of the class, they're required to do a 3-hour independent project each week and report on not only what they listened to and what they got from it, but also how they went through it. In order to prepare them for that, and so that they don't fall into that, I understood it, so I'm done. These are the 3 types of practice I suggest. The first is practice in comprehending more effectively. So not just comprehending, but getting better at it, including practice taking notes and doing a short summary at the end of what you remember and so on. I also really push, because I'm a linguist, processing. So the idea of what can you do so that you're better at comprehending faster speech? If you want to start working on accents, you need to practice with various accents. And then especially making processing more automatic. So improving the accuracy, the speed, and the capacity, your chunking capacity. And that can be helped by doing activities that support those. Regular listening, you can do, hundreds of hours of it, and you're going to get better at these probably. But you can do it more efficiently if you focus attention on it. And then increasing language knowledge. A lot of our students come in already knowing quite a bit about grammar, less about the sound system, and of course everybody wants to build vocabulary. So this is more the knowledge end. And depending on what you want within these 3 options, or some combination of them, that's going to affect what you actually do in your independent work. Here's an example of a technique for dictation that's I found the students are able to do and are happy to get control of it, because teachers, hi JB, I suspect this is me being told it's about time. All right, I'm almost done. That they don't have to do a whole sentence at a time, but as long as they're doing chunks, they can get something useful from this. This is an example procedure for building vocabulary. So a procedure is going to be a set of techniques. It's almost like a lesson, but it's something the student's creating, and they typically come up with their favorites. And alternate among them, but different students will have different paths that they like to go through the material with. This is what I expect from the students in my class so that they get out eventually to that level. And again, we have 10 weeks, just 1 2-hour session a week where we're actually in contact. This is an interesting link where students give peer advice to the class that's going to follow them. And so again, this is the link to the slides, and I'll try to pick that. Well, I'll pick it up in a moment. So my concluding remarks are, if you haven't done anything like this before, try it. Let your students do some independent work in listening specifically. Start small, one little 2-minute clip or something like that. Curate a small batch of things and let them pick. And then if you can, see if you can work with others, either at your own institution or outside of it. This is a link to a report on a study I did with a group of community college English teachers, in some cases working with fairly low-level students, and how they were able to become good at learner training with their students, and in the process actually transform some of their own teaching practices. So I believe that's it. Yep, that's the references. So I will go back here, stop my sharing. And thank you very much. I'll open it up to questions.